going crazy. They're jumping on each other.
One of the most unbelievable finishes you will ever see.
And welcome to it. Thanks for being with us here on Orioles Magic, the podcast presented by Miller Lite, our post-draft edition. Coming up, Jim Callis from MLB Network and MLBpipeline.com, hours after their coverage has wrapped up. And Geoff Arnold, the Orioles get some new prospects on that farm.
They picked Heston Kjerstad with the number 2 overall selection. It was something that our colleague Ben McDonald was on. He thought that might be able to happen. A lot of time for Ben covering the SEC. You heard Kjerstad's name rumored. Initially, I was pretty darn surprised, but I think I'm pretty excited about him from some of the folks that I've gotten to talk to. Not a whole lot of pitching. That was the other takeaway from the draft. I certainly thought day 2 at pick number 39, that's where the Orioles were going with a number of guys on the board, and Kjerstad, you imagine being an underslot sign. So, but instead they decided to go the position player route, get a couple of exciting high school players at the very end of day 2, and overall that farm stock looks to be a little bit richer right now.
I would say so. So let's get into it. Jim Callis on the Orioles 2020 draft. And as we are recording right now on Orioles Magic, the podcast presented by Miller Lite, someone who has probably not slept much in a week or two of MLB Network and MLBpipeline.com fame, Jim Callis on the 2020 draft for the Baltimore Orioles. Jim, we know that background all too well after the last few days.
Yeah, it's been on MLB Network probably more than ever before with the little unusual circumstances this year. After we get done with this podcast, I think I've got about an hour or so to pack up. I have like 4 or 5 cases of camera and lighting equipment in front of me that you can't see right now. But yeah, it's spent an awful lot of time in this position the last 2 or 3 days.
Well, as we are recording right now, we don't know about all the signs and the post-draft signs that are coming. But for a moment, let's assume the Orioles sign all of their picks, including the 2 high school kids that they got, the totality of the draft. What's your reaction to it for the Orioles?
I think it was a very good draft. I mean, again, we should be saying that because they had the number 2 pick. They had an extra choice. They had the highest bonus pool. Every year we do stories. It's usually me for MLB.com who had the best draft, as soon as it's over. And it's always the teams with the high picks and the extra picks, and the Orioles had both. But no, I mean, that said, I thought they had a very strong draft. I mean, they got 6 guys. I think all 6 of them were on our top 200. Not that that's the be all and end all, but they were all ranked by us, all highly regarded. All in our top 132, actually. And just to touch on the thing you said, I do think there will probably be a couple guys who don't sign, but signability always matters even in a normal draft. Last year, only 2 guys in the first 10 rounds didn't sign. So my assumption is unless guys fail physicals or maybe 1 or 2 guys got taken without parameters set, that the vast, vast majority of players, not just by the Orioles, but taken in the draft in the 5 rounds are going to sign. I just don't think teams are gambling too much on signability when you only had 5 or 6 picks in this year's draft.
Heston Kjerstad was the Orioles' first pick, number 2 overall selection, and there was some mention of his name when it came to some options that the Orioles might go to with that pick. Most people thought it was going to be Austin Martin from Vanderbilt. When the Orioles announced Heston Kjerstad with that selection, what was your level of surprise?
Yeah, it's weird because nobody usually comes out and tells you, hey, we're definitely doing this. Especially, maybe you sometimes with number 1 pick, you have certainty because they're picking number 1 and then get their guy. With Austin Martin, I thought it was going to be Austin Martin, but I never fully bought into it. I felt like it was like 55% Austin Martin, 45% they take somebody else and maybe save some money and do some damage later in the draft. Although I kept telling people, you have to take who you think the best player is. Everybody knows when Mike was with the Astros, they took Carlos Correa. They signed him for $4.8 million, and they let him get Lance McCullers. But what people don't realize, that was like the perfect case scenario for the Astros in that even though Carlos Correa kind of was like a late riser in the draft, if he doesn't go number 1, he was going number 2 to the Twins. And frankly, his agent messed that up. Like, his agent took less money. Like, his agent thought he was going to the Cubs at 6. And so that was kind of a perfect storm. It's not that easy to just take a really good player at the top and cut a deal in those cases. I feel a little bit bad for Heston Kjerstad, although I've liked the quotes I've seen out of him, because I think a lot of it has been asking, like, hey, you're not Austin Martin. What happened here? And, did you think you were going this high? And he kind of had a little chip on his shoulder about it. And, I think, somebody asked me about this on Twitter, and not to make fun of past Orioles picks, but I said, this is not Matt Hobgood. This is not a guy who people thought was going at the end of the first round, but they jumped up. I mean, there were a lot of teams interested in Heston Kjerstad. The Blue Jays were interested. I mean, the Royals were interested in Heston Kjerstad at 4. I think 7, 8, 9 with the Pirates, Padres, and Rockies were all on him hard. This is a guy, he had the best left-handed power in the draft. He has a great track record in the SEC from day one as a freshman. And with Team USA, SEC is the best college league in the country. So there really wasn't much more he could have proven at that level. I think the power is what draws you in the most, but he can hit too. And I think while he's not going to be a center fielder or a 30-30 guy or anything like that, he was a little quicker. He looked a little better in the outfield this year. And so he's a legit guy. And my understanding was the Orioles liked Austin Martin, but I don't think they loved him and felt like he was slam dunk, the number 2 guy in the draft. And I think they weighed their options. And, I don't know what their internal board was, if Austin Martin was actually number 2. But whatever it was, I think they had a group of guys who were closely clustered: Austin Martin, Kjerstad, maybe Nick Gonzalez, maybe even Zach Veen. All these guys went, towards the top of the round. And I think if they thought they were all close together, then they probably did the right thing by figuring, okay, like, what's maybe the most advantageous deal we can cut with one of these guys if we think they're all comparable talents. So I feel a little, like I said, I feel a little bad for Heston Kjerstad, because I think a lot of reaction was like, whoa, that's not Austin Martin. What just happened? And I know on our MLB Network broadcast, Dan O'Dowd said he thought Austin Martin was the best player in the whole draft, even better than Spencer Torkelson, who went 1. But this is – Heston Kjerstad was a very worthy, top 5 type of pick. And I think by taking him, it allowed them to do some damage later in the draft. Very long answer there.
It's interesting. We had Mike Elias on the other day, and he really, before the draft, dismissed the idea of trying to, gamble with the second pick. He said the only way you're doing that is if you feel they are equal or you secretly like the other guy more. The reaction, of course, is when you see all the mocks, if you're a fan, is Martin, and then anything that deviates from that is kind of a shock. But when you kind of delve into the power potential and you look at the Orioles system and how hard that is to kind of get, it kind of adds up in that way. I mean, if you really look at the Orioles system, there are a lot of guys, but how many guys could one day hit 30+? No,
that's true. And just with Martin, while like he kind of, I think, was the consensus number 2 prospect in the draft, he wasn't everybody's number 2 prospect in the draft. I actually had done a story where I was comparing Torkelson and Martin, talked to like 34 GMs and scouting directors, cross-checkers, and there were guys who didn't think Austin Martin was clearly the second best player in the draft. He had some throwing issues this spring. There's some questions on his position. So I definitely think, like you said, I think the public perception was that, Torkelson was 1, Martin was 2, and then there was everybody else. And I just don't think every team felt that way. And I think it was more, I mean, we're not going to get to see the Orioles board. It would be curious to see exactly how they had the guys lined up in order. But my sense was that it was close to 50-50. I went with my gut and went Austin Martin. So I was surprised. I mean, the name you had heard more was Nick Gonzalez, maybe, if they cut a deal, a little bit more than Kjerstad. But again, I don't know how they lined the players up, and I think they're somewhat comparable. Kjerstad had the most incentive to cut a deal because if he didn't, there was a chance he could have wound up going 9th or maybe even 10th. Like he could have gone 7th to the Pirates also. So I think it was a very strategic pick. And what Mike said is absolutely correct. The talent, you obviously have to look at the signability, but the ability is what matters most. You can't get cute when you're picking at number 2. You have to take a guy you think belongs at that pick.
From a defensive standpoint, how would you analyze where Kjerstad is, and what does he bring to the table from that side of the field?
Yeah, it's kind of, 45 to 50 speed on the 20/80 scouting scale. I mean, he was quicker this year. I mean, if you wanted to give him, average. You could, I think it just depends on what kind of times you get on him. So he's not a center fielder. He's got solid arm strength. So I think he's your prototypical right fielder that, has a solid arm and huge power, and he gets to it. He's got it's not the smoothest swing if you watch him, but he has really good timing at the plate and he makes it work. And again, not that they didn't draft him off of stats, but in terms of resumes and track record, his is right there with anybody's. Like I said, he went in from day one to Arkansas, which is a top-level program, almost won the national championship a couple years ago, and played from day one, set their freshman home run record, and has hit from power, basically since he got there. So it's you know what you're getting. I think he has a chance. You guys mentioned 30-plus. Yeah, he's 30-plus home runs, I think, is easy to say. And I also think there's a high floor with this guy. At worst – you're probably getting a 260, 20 home run guy. That to me is his floor. That's a pretty high floor. I know that doesn't sound great if Orioles fans are wait a minute, 260 with 20 home runs. I'm saying that's kind of the minimum I would have expected out of him. I think that's the safety net, and I think he will be better than that.
All right, let's move on in this Orioles draft with the 30th overall pick. They took a shortstop from Mississippi State, Jordan Westburg, someone that many say is a really great athlete. Another SEC player. Jim, your thoughts on him?
Yeah, with Westburg, again, another guy with track record. He's an offensive middle infielder. It's power over hit. He gets a little aggressive at times. So I think he's more of he's going to give you power than maybe hit 280 or 300. But this could be a 20-plus home run shortstop. I think he can stay there. It's solid speed, solid arm strength. It's possible. If you have a really good defensive shortstop, then maybe you move him to third. He's a bigger guy, 6'3", 203, but he moves pretty well for his size. You're looking at a guy here who guys don't really steal bases anymore, but he might be a 20 home run, 10 to 15 steal guy, play shortstop. And I do think he's got enough pop that his bat profile is at third base if he winds up having to move.
To me, one of the other real surprises was what the Orioles did with their third selection in Hudson Haskin, because I know I did, and I think a lot of other people figured the Orioles would go pitching at 39 with a lot of really good arms still out there. They go with Haskin instead. Was that unexpected for you? Did you think the Orioles were going to go pitching once they had that first pick of day two?
Yeah, if I had to guess, you never know for sure, but that would have been my guess. I thought, there were some good college arms. College pitching was its strength this draft. There's some good college arms that didn't make it into the first day just because there weren't enough spots, and there were also some interesting high school arms. 2 or 3 of the best high school pitchers were still on the board too. So yeah, that was my thought was that they would probably go that way. Haskin was interesting because I was a little surprised he didn't get more buzz in the spring. When we do our rankings, we had him ranked 74th, and the Orioles drafted him 39th. But when we do our rankings, it's not just, hey, we saw this or we heard this talking to scouts. We try to build a consensus of what the industry thinks. So on paper, I thought he was a guy initially they should rank higher, and I heard he was moving up. So we actually had him higher, and then we got some feedback. I was like, we don't think he's going to go, quite that good. And I actually think what it was is there just wasn't a lot of track record on him because he's a sophomore eligible. So he basically played 1 full season of college and 4 weeks of games this year. Didn't play in the Cape Cod League last year, but he played well in the New England Collegiate Baseball League, which is one of the better summer leagues. It's not the Cape. I just think if he had, he obviously still went pretty good. But let's say he had been in the SEC instead of at Tulane, and if he had played in the Cape instead of in the New England League, and if he had gotten a full season to show what he can do instead of really 1 season, then I think we probably would have ranked him higher. There would have been more consensus about him because this guy's got tools. He's got, his swing can get long, but he barrels the ball. He's got bat speed. He's got loft. He's a plus runner. This could be a 20-20 guy. He controls the strike zone pretty well too, so you feel like he's going to get to most of his offensive talent. I think he plays in center field. I don't think there's really any question about him staying there. So it's a really good – you don't usually get college players with those kind of tools, 39 picks into the draft. They usually go better than that.
Jim, the Orioles also drafted another shortstop in the 3rd round from the SEC, Anthony Servideo. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And, a lot of fans will look at this draft, and I think more were tuned in this year than normal for obvious reasons. and they'll see the redundancy of outfield and shortstop, and those who really follow the system know, the Orioles have a couple of guys who are, that they've talked about, like an Adam Hall, who's had some good minor league seasons, seems to be rising. I guess, a lot of these guys can move around the infield, and that's what Elias says, that, get a shortstop, that guy can move. But when you look at these two shortstops, how would you separate these two for one? And tell us about this young player.
Yeah, I think they're different. And I think what Mike said is true. I mean, you're just trying to build inventory. Like, nobody ever has a situation where they have too many players and it's a bad thing. I mean, you trade them in that case. Or, you have guys who maybe you have a utility man who's good enough to start, that type of thing. Servideo is a lot different than Westburg, even though they were, rival schools in the SEC, Ole Miss, Mississippi State. Westburg, like I said, power over hit. Servidio's hit over power, although he showed some surprising power this year. He had I'm looking here, an ops of about 1270 and played really well left on. As a lefty hitter against Reed Detmer, as a Louisville lefty who went 10th overall. He's faster than Westburg. I think he's a better defender at shortstop than Westburg. Like if those were your two starters, then Servideo would push Westburg to third. He doesn't have the track record. He really, really struggled in the Cape Cod League with wood bats last year. He played second base. I actually think he's better than the guy who was shortstop, Gray Kessinger, who was a second-round pick by the Astros last year. I think Servideo is a more talented defender, but Gray was the shortstop, and Servideo played second base, and he was kind of a light hitter, and he kind of came out of nowhere. I was curious to see where he was going to go in the draft because he did get off to a hot start, but they hadn't really gotten into conference play yet. He hadn't really proven himself in the SEC. It's interesting. I think you could argue both ways, really, that if he got into SEC play and he had a good year, then he probably goes in the second round. And I think you could say he was off to such a hot start. I don't think he was going to carry 1270 ops all year, and that if he'd struggled in the SEC some, he might have lasted another round. So you kind of had to figure out what you really thought of him because your history of Anthony Servideo as an offensive force is 4 weeks this year. But I do think even if he's not, I don't think he's going to be, like a guy who's putting up those huge numbers in pro ball. But I do think he has the tools to be a regular. He's more of an on-base guy than a power guy. He like I said, he's got speed, so he could steal some bases when he gets on, and he plays a really nice shortstop. So to me, what I like about this pick is you could see a scenario where he becomes a big league regular at shortstop, and let's say the bat, doesn't have as much impact as you hope for. The guy's good enough defensively, and he can do enough things that I think he's a really good utility man. Like there's no reason this guy couldn't play all over the infield, and really, I mean, if he was in a utility role, he runs well enough. I'm sure he could track balls in the outfield too. So there's some upside with this pick if the gains we saw offensively were real, and there's also a pretty good floor here because I think he can definitely play all over the diamond if you want him to.
When you look at the Orioles' fourth selection that they made, some early reports had right after the draft being over that Coby Mayo was going to go way over what he was supposed to be slotted into getting at his fourth selection. He's somebody that when you look at maybe some savings from the early rounds, a guy that the Orioles really wanted. What can you tell us about Coby Mayo?
Yeah, he's an upside guy. I mean, there's a little bit more risk with him, but there's a lot of upside there too. I mean, he's 6'5", 215, right-handed hitter, a lot of raw power. One of the strongest arms in the high school class in this year's draft. So he's got those two tools for third base. There's some question. There's mixed reports on swing and miss. Is he going to make enough contact to get to a lot of that power? Does he move well enough at third to stay there? His feet and hands are just okay. He gets compared. Jonathan Mayo mentioned this on the MLB Network broadcast last night. He gets compared to Austin Riley with the Braves, and I think that's a good comparison. It's power over hit. It's a big arm. But there's some questions as to whether he's going to really stay at third base. So I like that parallel. And it's an upside play, and I think, I've seen the reports too that he's going to get, considerably over slot, maybe more than $1 million over slot. And the idea would be, obviously looking at this draft that you saved money with Heston Kjerstad and some of that money is going to go to Coby Mayo and some of that's going to go to the fifth rounder too. And
that fifth rounder, right-handed pitcher from Dowling Catholic High School, Carter Baumler. Tell us about this young man.
Yeah, I'll say that pick surprised me. Not because I think it's a bad pick by any means. We actually had him ranked at 102, and he went 133. I just didn't think he was signable. I mean, he's a projectable high school pitcher. Those are the guys who were hurt more by the coronavirus because you didn't really get a chance to see with everything getting shut down, if they were going to get stronger, if their stuff was going to get better, how they were going to develop this year. And he pitched once this spring, and it wasn't a very good outing. I don't think anybody held that against him, but it certainly didn't help his cause. And he was a big-time commit to TCU. I mean, I had guys tell me, I think he's got, TCU license plate holder on his car and TCU stuff all over his house. And guys really liked him, but, the impression was, it's going to be really tough to sign him away from TCU. But yet, this could be a guy who 3 years from now, we're all going to be saying, oh, we should have paid Carter Baumler rather than let him go to TCU and really develop, because he's 6'2", 195. He's super athletic. He was on a state championship football team as a junior, as a kicker and a punter, and he even drew, college football interest. That's how good he was as a kicker and a punter. He's 90, 94. Curveball can be inconsistent, but shows flashes. He shows some feel for a changeup. But what guys really like is just such a clean, athletic delivery and arm action. So you feel like this guy's going to stay healthy and throw a lot of strikes. Like I said, I haven't counted them up, but when we rank players, we're ranking them based on long-term talent, not necessarily signability. And so when we looked at, after the draft's over, at the guys who didn't get drafted, or in a normal year in a 4-year-round draft, the guys who got drafted real low and aren't going to sign, I'd say if I looked at that list right now, probably 10 or 12 of the top 15 guys would be projectable high school pitchers, like Carter Baumler. And so to see one taken in the 5th round really threw me. But like I said at the top, I just don't think, and Orioles had 6 picks, that you're trying to waste 6 picks, because Orioles obviously need a lot of talent, and they only got 6 shots to draft guys. They'll, I assume, sign some $20,000 free agents too, but it's not a normal year where you're going to sign 30 guys out of the draft. You want to make all the picks count, and just the fact they took Kjerstad, like I said, he's probably going 7 to 9, so they saved some money there. I think they sign him. It would be my guess that you would sign Carter Baumler here.
The only pitcher that the Orioles decided to pick in the entire draft. Does this kind of confirm that the approach going forward is going to be you draft positional talent and then maybe you go out and sign some other pitchers later, or trade for other pitchers later? Is that kind of the approach based on that previous Houston, Chicago kind of example? Maybe.
I think Houston had some advantages that Baltimore doesn't, in that I think Houston valued some things in pitchers that maybe other people didn't see, and they were able to, cut a good deal for Charlie Morton and get a Will Harris and a Colin McHugh and change some things and get, value out of them. I don't know if that's as easy to do today, because I think more teams are on that same page. I honestly think, and you guys may have talked to Mike and he may have answered about this already, I think they just took the best guy on the board when they picked. I don't think they necessarily looked at it like, hey, we're going to go position player heavy, and we'll get pitchers from other sources. I think they just took the best guy on the board when their picks came up, and I do think that's the way to do it. Look, the Orioles don't have a good big league team right now. They're in a tough division. The farm system's getting better, but it's going to take some time. So I think at this point, you just get whoever you think the best players are. And then when you get ready to contend, maybe you fine tune it a little bit, or target guys in trades or whatever. But you can't. It's tough. Pitching's tough in the draft because it's so volatile. A lot of guys get hurt and don't pan out. It's just the nature of pitching. But you also can't run away from pitching, and I don't think the Orioles did, because if you do that, there are some pitching success stories in later rounds, but a lot of the best pitchers in baseball were high picks. And if you don't draft them, you don't get a shot at them, and unless you have something really good to give up in a trade. So I don't know that I necessarily think that they're going away from pitchers, or they're going to look to acquire them from other avenues. I just think that and I like teams that have conviction, that when they were picking, like we were saying, I thought they were going pitcher at 39, but I think they really liked Hudson Haskin, so they took Hudson Haskin. So it's kind of interesting. But I do think this was just, hey, these are the best guys, and this is who we took.
It is fascinating because you look at last draft, and it was heavy college positional talent, with the exception of Gunnar Henderson in there. And then eventually later in the draft, in the middle rounds, they went with some college pitching. But it is fascinating. And several GMs ago now, Andy McPhail, his whole mantra here, and it did set the stage for 5 years of winning here, was buy the bats and grow the arms. And you saw that in the draft as well, and through a lot of the trades that were made. But It's just an interesting, if this is a strategy, and he hasn't actually announced this as a strategy, but it's fascinating. Jim, big picture now, with 2 drafts for Mike Elias. We'll see what the international signing periods bring, and we've already had one, and he's worked some trades, and obviously inherited a team that was going to get the first pick, and he inherited a team that did a purge and already started kind of adding some talent to the system, and we'll see how those trades work out long term. But if you really take a step back and look at the top 10, 20, 30 here, I'm just going to read off, a list here. Rutschman, Grayson Rodriguez, D.L. Hall, Heston Kjerstad, Ryan Mountcastle, Austin Hayes, Jordan Westburg, Dean Kramer, Michael Baumann, Zach Lowther. And even in that next group, I mean, when you look at Diaz, Henderson, Aiken, Harvey, I mean, those would have been the top 10 of the Orioles of old. And now they're shuffling back 15, 20, 20 plus in a typical, top 10 or 30 ranking that you would come up with.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely think their system's on the upswing. I mean, obviously it helps when you have the number 1 pick and the number 2 pick, and you add an Adley Rutschman and a Heston Kjerstad. But there's depth too. Like you touched on Gunnar Henderson, and I think he gets overshadowed because he was in the same draft with Adley. But I like Gunnar Henderson a lot last year. I think he's a really interesting guy. Just like I think a lot of folks on Heston Kjerstad, but there were some teams that Jordan Westbrook was only 1 pick out of going in the true first round, but he was a first round pick for some teams. Hudson Haskin, like I said, I think guys knew who he was. I just think they didn't have as much track record with him, but I mean, those are tools that stack up with some of the guys who went in the first round too. So I do think they have more depth than they've had. And, the Grayson Rodriguez pick, a lot of people were surprised he went quite that high, especially being a high school right-hander, and there were other more highly touted high school right-handers in that draft. And he looks like a great pick too. And D.L. Hall, I mean, you kind of get a really nice nucleus of potential, super impact players, and also some depth as well.
The $20,000 signs are still the hardest thing to predict. I mean, nobody seems to know how it's going to go. If you're a team and you're signing $20,000 players, how much value can you add to your organization from going out and trying to tap into that market?
Yeah, I mean, I guess some of it's going to depend on how many of these guys sign. And I keep citing this statistic. Last year, there were 395 players who got 6-figure bonuses after the 5th round, who obviously couldn't do that this year because there's a $20,000 cap on non-drafted guys and only a 5-round draft. And the vast majority of those guys are college juniors. And I do think some of those guys will sign. I don't know if it'll be 100 out of that 395 or 150. I think it's unfortunate those guys can't get more money because they use that money to pay off college loans and kind of to survive when they're not making any money in the minor leagues. But at the same time, I mean, who knows what college baseball is going to look like? Most of these guys aren't on full scholarships in college. Almost nobody is. The economy's bad. Maybe paying for another year of college that you weren't planning on is going to be tough. We're going to have fewer minor league teams, it looks like, next year. So there may not be opportunities. It's only a 20-round draft next year. If everybody goes back, that draft's going to be jammed with guys who would have gone around 6 through 20 this year, guys who will go or would have gone 6 through 20 next year. They all can't get drafted. Draft might get reduced even more from 20 rounds to say 10. So I do think some of these guys will sign. Like if you went to college and your career goal was to play pro ball, you should probably take $20,000 because going back, you're going to be a year older and teams look at age. And yeah, guys will retain the same eligibility. So if you were a junior this year, you'll be a junior next year, but you'll be like a 22 and a half year old junior next year. And teams don't pay or value 22-year-old players in the draft very much. So to me, if your dream is to play pro ball and you get offered $20,000, again, it sucks. That's what your cap is. But if you get offered $20,000 and they can give you scholarship playing money to pay for the rest of your schooling, if you go back at some point, I think some guys are going to take it. I'll be curious. Like I said, I feel like the number's higher than what the agents think it'll be right now. I think it's kind of the shock for some guys that they didn't get drafted is still settling in. So like maybe 100 of those guys will sign or 150, but there's value. I mean, there's good players who come out of the draft after the 5th round every year. And if let's say there's 100 or 150 of these guys who would have signed in a normal year for 6 figures that'll sign for 20, there's going to be a scramble for them. I think from the Orioles standpoint, and I know teams are kind of preparing. Some teams are prepared like videos and basically recruiting materials because everybody can offer the same bonus for these guys. I think what the Orioles have to offer is two things. One, obviously, Mike Elias and Sig coming from Houston have brought over a lot of the technology and modernized play, a lot of the modern aspects of player development. And I'm sure they're going to emphasize that to players. Like, look, these are some of the things we do. Look at the success we had in Houston, making guys better. We can make you better. So I think that's a big selling point. Two, honestly, having a bad major league team right now and having an upcoming but not elite farm system, if I'm a player and the Orioles are interested in me and I'm buying into like, hey, look what they're doing to make guys better, this stuff sounds fascinating, I'm going to have a real opportunity to advance with the Orioles. So I would think, again, they can't offer any more money than anybody else is, but I would expect that the Orioles have a chance to do fairly well in the $20,000 game, which will commence on Sunday.
Yeah, it's going to be very crowded for the next few drafts. At some point, it must normalize. And a couple more, Jim. One is, what's your sense of what Major League Baseball can do if the minor league season is wiped out as far as player development? I mean, whether it's an expanded Arizona Fall League or several leagues, Florida and Arizona, to at least get some innings and ABs out of your upper half prospects. I mean, is that conceivable at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think it hinges on having a major league season, which, Rob Manfred expressed 100% confidence, the first night of the draft in an interview with Tom Verducci that we'd have a season. Seems like they're maybe getting a little closer. But assuming we have a season and then that goes off okay, and, COVID doesn't come back and, pose a problem, I would suspect we'll see, perhaps even as early as a month into, after a month of major league games go off without a hitch, or maybe a little bit later. The fall league thing, I mean, whatever we have, whether it's expanded fall league or just Florida, Arizona, I think it's going to take place at the team complexes on the backfields. I don't think with the revenues down this year that you're going to have a lot of prospects. You might have 18 per organization, or maybe you have an older team and a younger team, or maybe some of the older guys are on your expanded major league roster and taxi squad. I mean, we'll have to see how those things work out. But I think we'll see something at the complexes. I'm just thinking this through. The reason I paused is, the fall league, they moved up last year, but it was end of September into October. Well, we're already seeing there's talk. The owners want no part of baseball being played in November, postseason baseball, because of fear that COVID's going to come back in the winter. So my guess is you would want to get your development games played as soon as you could, because what if it comes back in October and wipes out your expanded fall league? So I think what we're going to see is you'll see the teams take their best prospects once they get all clear. We figured out how we're managing this, because you have to have innings and at bats. The at bats. It's not great if Adley Rutschman doesn't get at bats, although he's pretty advanced. Or say Gunnar Henderson needs at bats, but what you really need is innings. You can't take Grayson Rodriguez and DL Hall from 100 to 110 innings and not have them pitch, or even if they pitch they might get 60 innings this year. Well, if they get 60 innings this year, you probably can't ramp them back up over 100. Teams are very careful about increasing the workload of their young pitchers in steps. So they're going to have to do something. And you just mentioned this for the draft. I mean, pitching is going to be altered in baseball for 3 or 4 years. Like, I don't know the effects on older guys, but because I don't know. Like usually when they get to the big leagues, you kind of turn loose. But your starting pitchers in big leagues are pitching 150 plus innings a season. If we have a 70-game season this year, what are they going to pitch? Like 75 innings, maybe tops? Can you ramp those guys back up to 150 next year, or is that going to do damage to their arm? So I don't know. And especially with the young players, they need those innings. They need those at-bats. Especially for the Orioles, you're not playing for 2020. You're playing for the future. The probably most important player in the organization this year was Adley Rutschman. And Grayson Rodriguez continuing to develop, and DL Hall, and these draft guys. So we'll have something. I'm pretty confident, but I think it'll probably be limited to like a team, maybe 2 teams max worth of prospects for each club, or maybe you have like a large roster with a taxi squad of 40 or 45 prospects, and one day you play your older guys and one day you play your younger guys. There'll be something, because there has to be, but I don't. They got to figure out the major league season first. There has been a lot of talk, And I'm pretty confident it will have to happen at spring training complexes. And they'll try to get as many innings or at-bats as they can, but it's going to be for select. I just don't think you're going to see teams want to have, hey, all 200 of our minor leaguers come in, because A, it's going to be hard to manage, and B, just the cost. I think it's going to be a pretty limited number.
From a taxi squad standpoint, you obviously have to keep those guys in shape and ready to go, because the risk of injuries when you start a major league season is going to be incredibly high this year. Do you think there's maybe any possibility that you could take somebody like a Rutschman, a Kjerstad, a Grayson Rodriguez, a DL Hall, somebody like that, and maybe send them to where the taxi squad is, just so you can get games in, so those taxi squad players that you have maybe don't have as high of a risk of injury? I mean, it's one of the things it's that I've kind of thought of. Like, do you think there's any reality in that happening?
I think that's tough, because it just adds more people that you have to keep healthy and not get infected and could spread. Like, the more people you bring in, the greater the risk you have of somebody bringing in. I mean, I know they're going to be testing for it, but obviously the more people you bring in, they're exposed to more people, greater risk for people getting infected. I would be surprised. I mean, maybe like after a month of games get going, but because I think they're going to be very cautious. Because if they start a major league season, let's say they start July 10th, I'm just picking a date here, about a month from now, and guys are getting sick a week in, it's just going to shut it down immediately. So no, I mean, I think you could see some teams, even how service time would be handled would be a factor. But you could have some teams say, again, the service time would be the key. I could see the Orioles, if service time were not an issue, perhaps saying, you know what, let's put Adley Rutschman on the taxi squad. And we're not going to throw him to the Wolves, but let's let him play once a week or twice a week. And he can work out with our team, and he'll play twice a week against big league pitching. And, teams are going to have deep – you're going to see a lot of AAA caliber pitchers in the big leagues this year, because I think we're going to see guys going shorter amounts of innings into games and using more pitchers with these expanded rosters and taxi squads. That might be preferable than having Adley Rutschman do nothing. And again, if I have to give him service time, then they probably don't want to do that, because it accelerates his free agency. But I do think you'll see some teams, think about that. And I would assume, I don't know where things stood in spring training, which seems like it was a year ago, but like your Dean Kramers and Michael Bauman's and, Yusniel Diaz's, who would have been in AAA maybe, will be, part of that expanded big league roster, because A, you're going to need players, and B, those guys were on the cusp anyway. So why not? So I think you'll see that, but I think it'll be interesting, because I think you're going to have to, I don't know how they're going to handle service time on those guys. Like, I don't know if you're going to see teams really want to give, like 6 guys who might have been AAA a full year's service time because they're on the taxi squad. And they obviously haven't worked that out yet, but that'll be another thing that they will have to figure out.
Yeah, I mean, the expectation was the Kramers and the Aikens and the Bruce Zimmermans of the world and Ryan Mountcastle, they were going to make an appearance around July 1st anyway. You might as well, I mean, for the fans, I mean, I get the service time aspect, but if you're there's really no need for the stopgap measures that they had signed at this point, because that was to essentially bridge the gap to those guys anyway who are going to come this season. Last one, Jim. Next year's draft, we don't know how it's going to look as far as how they select and how all that will look. If it's just based on a poorest record, to the best. But if you are picking at one next year, is Kumar Rocker the odds-on favorite?
You could argue he might not even be the best draft pick on his team next year, because Jack Leiter was looking great, and he'll be a draft-eligible sophomore next year. Yeah, I mean, those would be 2 guys to look at. It's funny. That's on my to-do list, but more for Monday and Tuesday was to look ahead at 2021, and I haven't really yet. But, yeah, I mean, so you could – how about Vanderbilt pitcher?
Vanderbilt pitcher. Got it.
Odds-on favorite to go number 1 would be a little safer play there, I think.
All right. Well, Jim, we really appreciate it. We know it's been a long road. Thank you so much. Great work on MLB Network and all the writing and mocks that you've done. So we really appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, no problem. Thanks. It was good talking to you, Brett and Geoff. And, things continue to look up for the Orioles.
Yeah, it's going to be fun to see. Hopefully you see some baseball soon. Jim Callis of MLBpipeline.com and MLB Network. Thanks again.
Thank you.
We cannot thank Jim Callis enough. It is tough to get into that draft grind. He's doing, all kinds of interviews before and after, plus the coverage goes forever. But I think it's interesting, Geoff. If you look at the Orioles' trends in the Mike Elias era, heavy positional talent, as we talked about, heavy big conference talent, and a lot up the middle, a lot of shortstops, a lot of center fielders, and a catcher, a couple of catchers last draft early. And that's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. Shying away from pitching, I would say the Orioles' pitching stock is good. Eventually, you're going to need to come up with more because that's such a depth area. Guys get hurt often. And also the realities of the American League East. I've seen in my time a lot of damaged egos that could not get over the American League East hump. So you need a lot of guys. But I think from a totality standpoint, and you've seen most of the Orioles prospects up close, it's probably from a depth standpoint and a high-end standpoint as good as it's been in perhaps decades.
Pitching is good for the Orioles. There's Grayson Rodriguez and DL Hall at the top. I think Dean Kramer is really good. And I think you can expect most of those guys, I would imagine, to make the major leagues. It's a little harder to say that definitively because Grayson Rodriguez was probably going to the Carolina League this year, and DL Hall was probably going to go to the Carolina League or AA this year. So it's a little bit harder to bank on those guys when they haven't really made it to the AA level yet. But I guess for me, I thought the Orioles would take some more pitching in this draft because of how deep the college pool of pitching was. And as Jim Callis talked about on the podcast, a lot of pitching doesn't pan out. A lot of guys get hurt and they never make it to the major leagues and they never reach their full potential. The Orioles, though, decided to go more of a position player route. Talk about the number of shortstops that they picked because it's the most skilled position on the field. And if it doesn't work out at shortstop, then you can put them at third base, you can put them at second base,
right.
You can put them in the outfield, first base. There's just so many options of what you can do with a shortstop. And there were a lot of power guys as well that the Orioles decided to go to. We know what Kjerstad did in the SEC. Westburg is another guy who can hit for some power. And then Coby Mayo, he was a 70 grade on a 20 to 80 scout scale as far as power goes from there. There is swing and miss with all three of those guys that is associated with that, but it's very obvious that is something that they value. They feel that they can develop hitters, and then maybe the hope is that if you need to go get some pitching, you can do it via trade, you can do it via signing free agents, or you can do it on the international market, which is the next big period coming up for the Orioles.
Yeah, and looks like the Orioles are going to go all in there. But I'm saying from a totality standpoint, position and pitching, that if you look at this top 10, top 15, top 30, top 50, it is at a decades high talent point. And I'm talking about from the depth standpoint and from a high-end standpoint. I'm not just talking about pitching. But if you look at Rutschman, Hall, Rodriguez, Kjerstad, Mountcastle, Hayes, Westburg, Kramer, Bauman, Lowther, Diaz, Henderson, Aiken, Harvey, and right on down the line. I'm not saying they're all making it. Of course that's not true. Most of them won't. But I'm saying from a depth standpoint and a high-end potential standpoint, this is as good as I've seen. I mean, the guys I would put in that 20 to 30 range would be guys who were in that top 10 ranking from just a few years ago.
Well, that's the whole thing is the system has taken a massive step in the right direction, and it started with some trades where you pick up some different pieces from Machado that you trade Machado to the Dodgers,
those guys.
And you get, and then the same thing is true with adding a guy like Dylan Tate and Cody Carroll who might be able to help the Orioles now with the Yankees and trading Zach Britton over there. So I agree with you. The amount of impact players is big because in the past, at least when I started in the Orioles system, there were a lot of players where it was, this guy can reach the major leagues. Do I think he's going to do a lot when he gets there? Probably not. But now you have, like you said, impact players at the very top of your system who you can build around. And Heston Kjerstad, Mike Elias is pretty excited, and I'm excited too because there is not a guy that exists in the Orioles farm system like him right now.
Yeah, it really isn't. Mountcastle has a lot of power. Hopefully get to see it soon. But that's a tough commodity to go buy, and you really need to go get it in the draft or through the international sign period. We know, as Buck Showalter says, they still give a lot of money to guys who can put it where the grass doesn't grow. And that will hold true throughout time. So Pitching wise, I will say, I mean, I'm not sure if this is the best farm system era of pitching. I mean, there was a period, and it led to a lot of good years where they were about to go Tillman, Britton, Arrieta, Mattis, a lot of high-end talent there that were all knocking on the door at the same time. So, but I'm saying the totality of it, it's pretty special right now. So that's what needs to happen. That's what we all know needs to happen. And we'll see if these guys pan out. There's no sure thing. I mean, it's the biggest crapshoot of all the drafts. But I enjoyed the interest in this year's draft, given I think I hate the 5 rounds, but I also think it makes it easier for fans to follow because I think they get overwhelmed by a 40-round draft. And given what we're going through right now with the pandemic and the lack of live sports going on, it was a good opportunity for baseball. And the Orioles go get a big slugger to put in right field, hopefully, as Tim Corbin of Vanderbilt says, peppering the warehouse windows for a while.
I'm excited for Kjerstad. He can hit for power. I don't think people know as much how good of an average hitter he was, too, especially with some of the adjustments that he made this year as well as in the summer of last year when he was playing for Team USA. And I think by him hitting for a higher average, it's going to allow for him to hit for better power. And Brad Seelig, the Orioles domestic scouting supervisor, made this point in a conference call after the draft got done on Thursday night. When he is getting his pitch and it's in the zone, he's not missing it. So a lot of that swing and miss coming on pitches outside of the zone, and as he continues to refine his approach, I think you're going to see a lot of home runs, a lot of power, and a guy that will probably only get better defensively. And another thing that Blaine Knight, who I talked to, pointed out was that his speed is something that the University of Arkansas worked on him with as well. So getting better in every facet. You know how the Orioles, the mantra for them, for pretty much everybody, from players to coaches to managers to player development people, growth mindset. So I think they got one of those in Kjerstad too.
Yeah, and congratulations to Mike Elias and his domestic scouting staff, and a draft complete, a bizarre one, one that we'll remember for a long time, given the nature of it. But Geoff, really great stuff, and going through it all with Jim Callis. We'll catch up soon, as always, Geoff.
I enjoyed it, Brett. We'll talk to you down the road.
All right, this has been another edition of Orioles Magic, the podcast presented by Miller Lite.